Hello, everyone. This is Professor Joseph. We are in the grad section of RAL 3106. I guess it would technically be RGL 5937. Special topics. We're discussing social theory for studying religion in Latin America. And we've come to, I believe it's week 8. In this semester in the fall of 2020 in the post-apocalypse, or maybe we're still in the middle of it. At any rate, we've come to the end of the book that we've been looking at. We've gone through chapter by chapter, a very short book, only about 100 pages, by Brian H. Smith, called, it's about Catholicism and Pentecostalism in Latin America and politics. And so it's a comparative study. And we've seen in a previous essay by David Smild, we've seen a review of this book as well as a couple others by Paul Freston and Timothy Stenega that are also comparative studies, which shows some of the value that a comparative study can hold. In this case, Brian Smith is using somewhat of a Weberian technique of forming an ideal type of official Catholicism in Latin America, and contrasting and comparing it to an ideal type of Pentecostalism in Latin America. Of course, the danger with this approach is that there are many different kinds, is an immense diversity of Pentecostalism in Latin America, and there's also a huge diversity of Catholicism in Latin America. You have popular Catholicism, you have liberationist or progressive Catholicism, you have traditional Catholicism, you have charismatic Catholicism, and so there's a danger that by creating these two ideal types and then comparing and contrasting him, that he's glossing over a lot of diverse possibilities within those two camps. There's also regional differences from country to country. Catholicism in Mexico is extremely different from Catholicism in Brazil, which is extremely different than Catholicism in Uruguay. Nonetheless, let's finish up this last chapter and look at his conclusions. And to that, I'm going to go to my notes. So, this is Brian H. Smith, Religion and Politics in Latin America, Catholic versus Pentecostals. One of the reasons why this book interests me is because of the massive growth of Pentecostalism in Latin America since about 1960. One might assume that it would have a distinct influence on the Latin American ethos on the ground, or in the grassroots, through the change of personal habits, theological beliefs, etc. We'll talk more about that. So he looks at three possible paths forward in his last chapter, after having carefully studied and documented Catholicism and done the same thing for Pentecostalism. Now he's asking the question, where do we go from here? Remember, this was written in 2000. So we've already gone from there in at least 20 years in. So one possibility is otherworldly spirituality. The second possibility he sees is conflicting agendas. And the third possibility is prophetic social catalysts. So let's talk about the first one. In the mutually reinforcing flight from the world, otherworldly spirituality. So he considers the possibility that either conservative Catholicism or Pentecostalism might take flight from this world and focus more and more on private spirituality and otherworldly rewards, thinking about going to heaven, rather than focusing on social structures, social injustice, politics, improving lives here and now in practical ways. Now, this could be both of them or either one of them. Many Pentecostal groups would already be considered rather otherworldly in their orientation. Within Catholicism, charismatic Catholicism, which we haven't talked a lot about. I think we have in the other portion of the course. There's maybe one chapter about it. But charismatic Catholicism tends to be more privately oriented towards private spirituality, and then does liberationist theology, obviously. So that's a possibility. Perhaps both of these groups will throw up their hands and stop worrying about global inequities or economic inequities or human rights or social justice and just focus on private spirituality. And he mentions Jean-Pierre Bastien and Lalive d'Espinay are two scholars who predicted precisely that tendency or direction. He finds it unlikely in that chapter that both will turn to an otherworldly spirituality. However, I don't know that he comes to an absolute conclusion. It's just one possibility. So the second possibility is conflicting political agendas or religious agendas, page 91. And he points out that Catholicism and Pentecostalism have very different social, economic, and political agendas. Although in some areas, in terms of sexual morality or the family, their agendas might be very similar. So it's possible that one of these religious groups could focus an ever greater measure on free market policies and support of democracy. The other might turn to demanding greater state controls and authoritarianism. This is interesting because I'm tempted to include in these two possibilities liberation theology, but liberation theology I think would tend to be somewhat hostile towards free market policies and might be more sympathetic with state controls. Pentecostals are very, some people have compared in the Pentecostals to entrepreneurs in the religious free market analysis or the rational choice analysis that Pentecostalism allows fairly uneducated and marginal people to rise to the top because of charisma and opportunity and initiative in ways that traditional Catholicism does not. So it's a little hard to fit in one or the other into those two and say with any kind of certainty which one would tend to be more supportive of which of those two options. There's also the whole movement of new religious movements in Brazil and elsewhere that focus on the prosperity gospel, the idea that you can receive health and wealth by exercising faith. There's also the fact that many Pentecostal churches, Pentecostal leaders are very authoritarian, and people blindly follow them. On the other hand, the Catholic Church has on occasion been accused of a fair amount of authoritarianism. So he goes through this section and analyzes it over several pages. He points out that conservative Catholics might support corporatism. Corporatism would lean towards the idea of state controls and authoritarianism. And within Catholicism and beginning in Pentecostalism as well, there's a sharp criticisms of an unbridled capitalism without a conscience. So he's saying, and he gives some data to support his statement of fact there, that both Pentecostal leaders, Catholics, are critical of unbridled capitalism with no conscience. So I made a note to myself there. I'm thinking this through as I'm taking these notes. I want to know myself, how does this affect their everyday behavior? How does this affect their worldviews? Does it change their economic behavior, their family life, their relationships to politics or political elites? This would require a grounded study, I'll talk more about that later, or of a more grassroots participant observation, which would be one of my criticisms of Smith's book. It's not exactly a strong criticism, but he sets up a analytical framework with two ideal types, and then he goes through and analyzes and compares them on a number of empirical issues, but it's mostly aimed at the top level, that is the bishops and the bishops and archbishops in Latin America, speaking for the church, public pronouncements, Pentecostal leaders who are heading their own Pentecostal networks, and political parties. And so he's looking at this more or less top level of leadership, public pronouncements, direct involved in politics, and he's not looking in this book at everyday behavior, everyday practices at the grassroots. That would be require more of an anthropological approach. He's taking a political science approach, I believe. And grounded theory or grounded study requires an immense amount of participant observation, where you take what Clifford Geertz called thick description, where you carefully document and describe everything around you over a period of time, and then you, without a theory, without a guiding theory or hypothesis, ideally, and then you go back and go through your thick description or your notes, and out of it may emerge an obvious theory that you hadn't even thought of. So that's a different approach than what Brian Smith takes, but it's one that I would personally be more interested in. 3 is prophetic social catalyst moving in tandem, ? That's because this is a long shot in his mind. And he points out that Catholic and Pentecostal groups do have overlapping moral concerns. Chronic poverty is a moral concern. Alcoholism, the abuse of women, and corruption in public office. All of these are moral concerns for both religious groups. And he says that it is true that the local communities promoted by Catholics and Pentecostals seem now to be the most vital cultural movements among the poor today in Latin America. And he cites Brian Froley and Philip Berryman as sources for that statement. Collaborative reinforcement of their efforts could only enhance their efforts. So he's proposing here the idea, what if Catholics and Pentecostals, in whatever configuration you want to put that in, probably at the leadership level, came together and joined forces to influence their communities towards social action to demand human rights, to demand proper treatment of women, to focus on developing therapy and remedial programs for alcoholism. What if they joined forces to work on the issue of poverty and to help the poor? What would be the chances of that? That sounds a little utopian, and certainly would sound wonderful to many people who are concerned about those issues. And so he goes through that scenario and tries to analyze the possibility that they might join forces for good. They might join forces to ameliorate the worst aspects of poverty and alcoholism and abuse in their societies. He points out that one point of agreement between Pentecostals and Catholics are the moral positions, especially involving sexuality in the family. They oppose divorce. They oppose sex education to fight AIDS. They're in opposition to liberalization of homosexual rights or same-sex marriage, for example. That may complicate, says Brian Smith, democratic policymaking for pluralistic societies. Probably a small understatement. He also points out that there are some of the obstacles that would have to become in order for them to work together. In Mexico, for example, 54% of Pentecostal pastors do not believe that Catholics were true Christians in the 1980s. In the 1980s, by the way, I was living in Colombia, and I can certify that that sentiment was very prevalent among Protestants in Colombia. I came from Ohio, and I had Catholic charismatic friends in the United States, and I was not accustomed to thinking of Catholics as non-Christians. Even today, many of my Catholic friends will say, well, they're Christians, I'm Catholic. And I have to point out to them, Catholics are Christians too. We're part of one big faith. But in Colombia, this was not the case. They were very convinced that Catholics were not Christians. I had one young man talk to me about some reference to a verse in Revelations about the whore of Babylon being the mother of all these things, and he was making some implication about Catholicism. I understand there are conspiracy theories out there, but that's beyond the scope of our conversation today. So in Mexico, for example, Pentecostals are not likely to work easily with Catholics for common goals. I would say from my own personal experience that's also true in Colombia. 61% of Chilean Protestants rejected the idea of dialogue with Catholics. In many countries, the Catholic Church receives government subsidies to help finance educational institutions. Also, the constitutions of a number of countries still make special mention of the Catholic Church. Oh, I can't turn it off. Okay, let me just turn the sound down. That's the next best thing. Okay, so many constitutions still protect or project the Catholic Church as having a special role in the nation. Protestant-aligned political parties in Brazil and Nicaragua are lobbying to receive special mentions of Catholicism from constitutions and remove special privileges. So we saw earlier that an area of common concern was personal morality. And that may, even if Catholics and Protestants were to come together, that might complicate democratic issues in pluralistic societies, as it does here in the United States. But another area of potential conflict is the area of the relationship of the Catholic Church to the state, because Protestants are very vehemently opposed to the Catholic Church being given a special preferred status or receiving subsidies for Catholic education. So there's still a great deal of animosity between Protestants and Catholics, not to mention growing intense competition for adherence. It makes option 3 seem unlikely. And then he goes on to give some examples, and I hit the wrong thing, did I? Nope, I didn't want that. All right, let me go back. So he gives some examples of limited cooperation. So in some places, with some people in Latin America, there have been attempts for Catholics and Protestants to build bridges and work together. One example is in Mexico. Bishop Samuel Ruiz, I'll say it in Spanish, who I believe is also well known for his progressive views and his tendency to support liberation theology. He set up aid programs to assist poor Pentecostals expelled from their homes and persecuted for refusing to honor local village fiestas in honor of the saints. What a great message to poor Pentecostals who are being persecuted for their faith and suffering because they choose to opt out of certain Catholic traditions, but for the Catholic bishop to be the sponsor of financial aid programs. That's a proactive approach to cooperation, and maybe an inspiration for us here in the United States to take a different tack on religious activism. In some countries, Catholic bishops have united with Pentecostal pastors to oppose liberalizing legislation regarding abortion, homosexuality, and divorce. It could be argued if this fits the category of prophetic or ideological. I would tend to lead towards ideology. So, good examples, maybe depending on your personal social views, maybe bad examples. And the whole issue of ideology and faith is an important one too, that I'm not going to talk about today, but maybe I will at some point. And so, moving down, there's two policy areas where there's significant interaction between Catholics and Pentecostals. Separation of church and state, where they disagree. Moral consensus. And sexuality, where they agree. So in both cases, absolutist positions have been staked out by both groups, which may be at odds with the majority view of the public. People who tend to be more secular, people who are not active in either church, may disagree with both Catholics and Pentecostals on a couple of these issues. Within Catholicism, the laity largely do not support the absolutist views of the bishops. They kind of ignore it. So the bishops say that they should not use contraception, and 90% of Catholics use it anyway. And so they've learned to live and ignore their leadership in some areas. Pentecostal faithful tend to agree much more closely with their church leaders. At the end of the 1990s, there was some evidence that the rate of Pentecostals was slowing down. The rate of growth was slowing down. Costa Rica in 1989, 8.9% identified as Pentecostal, but another 8.1% said that they were no longer going to a Pentecostal church. Of the 8%, the majority had returned to the Catholic Church, where a large percentage no longer identified with any religion. In the Pew Research categories here in the United States, and also Gallup, those have been referred to with some nuance as the nuns and duns. The nuns are those who say, nun as in N-O-N-E, that they don't claim any affiliation religiously, even though they may still have some private spirituality. The duns are those that have been very involved in church and they just said, I'm done with it. They throw up their hands and they walk away. And so that category is rapidly growing in the United States, and apparently there is a small category, but growing category in Costa Rica as well. In Mexico, I can't pronounce that word, recidivism has reached 5% among the second generation converts. This includes burnout from high moral demands, poor quality of teaching and preaching, limitations on women in leadership, the attractions of materialism, uneasiness with isolation from non-Pentecostal neighbors, poaching from other Pentecostal churches. So in the future, Brian H. Smith concludes, it is unlikely that a broad Catholic Pentecostal alliance will emerge. So, Brian Smith sets up several scenarios and knocks them all down, and shows that likely none of them are the path forward. The path forward is likely to be uncertain and surprising and different than what he has imagined here. My criticism of the book is I think it's an excellent study using a very kind of comparative analysis and Weberian ideal types to analyze. It gives a really good logical framework for analyzing Catholicism and Pentecostalism politically. What it does not do is it doesn't give a window into the changes in everyday practical lifestyle of people who are converting from being marginal Catholics to being active Pentecostals. That approach would require something very different. Elizabeth Brusco, I think I've mentioned to some of you, is a female anthropologist who did a study in Colombia in the 1990s, in which she did a lot of interviews. She visited a lot of homes of women Pentecostals or evangelicals, I think she called them, in Colombia, to ask them why they converted to evangelicalism. And she found that there was a definite personal advantage, a rational choice to improve their family's life, to improve their husband's behavior by their conversion to Pentecostalism. And also, there's a few other sources that have done that, and they tend to be more anthropology than political science. Let's see if I can find a list here. Rowe in Ireland did a study in Brazil on religion and politics in 1992. He did a lot of interviews. I believe he's a sociologist. Of course, I mentioned Elizabeth Brusco. John Burdick, also 1992, Looking for God in Brazil, did more of a grounded theory anthropological study with a lot of participant observation and interviews with both Catholic liberationists and Protestant Pentecostals, and also I think he included Afro-diasporan religions. David Martin does something a little bit different. He's a sociologist, and we're going to talk about him before the course is over, but he sees a lot of parallels between the role of Pentecostals in Latin America today and what the role that Methodists played in England in the Industrial Revolution, and then even earlier the Calvinists and the ascetic Protestants in the launching of capitalism. So we'll talk about him. You notice there was a kind of an explosion of studies in 1992. So that's all for today. Thank you once again, and I hope you enjoyed this and it gave you some food for thought, and we will talk again. Thank you.